On April 6th, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement announced an online change of address form for non-citizens. The new form gives non-citizens the option to update their information online, in addition to the existing options of doing so by phone or in person at a field office. It will enable non-citizens to comply with their immigration obligations more easily and improve the accuracy of address information reported to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement by utilizing address autofill to ensure the United States Postal Service standardization. The new tool will be deployed in a rolling release with full availability anticipated in the next coming weeks. ICE Deputy Director and Senior Official performing the duties of the Director, Tay D. Johnson, said, "This is another critical innovation to improve compliance with immigration obligations and increase the efficiency of the process." After successfully entering a valid mailing address, if the non-citizen is currently in removal proceedings, the interactive online form will show the non-citizen information on how to also change their address with the immigration court as required using the Executive Office for Immigration Reviews Form EOIR 33, which is the change of address contact information. This may be submitted by mail, can be done in person with the immigration court, or online. Now, what's most important about all of this is it is vital to comply with this requirement because the immigration court is only responsible to send notices of hearings to the address it has on file. Therefore, an immigrant cannot claim lack of service. An immigrant cannot claim knowledge about their hearing date if they missed it, if they fail to keep the court informed of their correct address. And if you miss your hearing date, you get an order of deportation, an order of removal in absentia. So it's very important to make sure you change your address with the immigration courts. And now with this new online tool, the immigration courts have made it a little easier to do it. Now, to determine if a non-citizen will need a notice to appear, ICE will run system checks to make sure that the non-citizen is not already in removal proceedings, does not have an affirmative asylum application with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and does not have a final order of removal. Tax day, for those who did not do it, it was April 18th this year instead of April 15th because the 15th fell on a Saturday. And anytime a deadline falls on a Saturday or Sunday, the IRS pushes the due date to the following Monday, which would have been April 17th. However, Emancipation Day was observed in Washington, D.C. on April 17th this year, which pushed tax day back to Tuesday, April 18th. Except for people living in disaster areas in Alabama, California, and Georgia, everyone needed to file their taxes by April 18th of this year. But even though there were years when tax day may fall on a different day than the usual April 15th, there is one fact about taxes that is unchanged year after year, but is always overlooked in the immigration debate. And that is that experts estimate that undocumented immigrants pay billions and billions and billions of dollars. I didn't say millions, I said billions upon billions upon billions of dollars in federal taxes annually between tax returns filed and taxes deducted from their paychecks. And there are three good reasons why an immigrant who is undocumented would want to pay taxes. One, shows you're complying with the federal tax laws. Because if you're working undocumented, or whether documented or not, you're working undocumented, you're working against your visa, you have no visa. The law requires you to pay taxes on the income you earn in the United States. Two, so everybody who works, green card, no green card, visa, no visa, entered without inspection, got to pay your taxes. So if you do it, you're complying with the law. Two, paying taxes can help demonstrate good moral character if you're undocumented and later have an opportunity to legalize your immigration status via adjustment of status. Because whenever you file an adjustment of status application, you always have to prove good moral character. And if you work and don't pay your taxes, that could be a reason for the immigration officers to say you do not have good moral character. And paying taxes could also be used to document work history and presence in the United States, steps that may help you be eligible for legal immigration status in the future. If lawmakers ever pass any immigration reform, the immigration reform is going to be, you had to be here by a certain date. And what better way to prove you were here by that date than you were here filing taxes on that date? Now, critics of illegal immigration have long argued that undocumented immigrants who pay taxes are able to do so because they're using stolen Social Security numbers. But millions of federal tax dollars are paid every year by people who were granted Social Security numbers validly. Either they were here on all different types of visas and then they fell out of status. They filed adjustment applications that got denied, but their Social Security numbers are valid. And even as many or more tax returns are being filed by undocumented immigrants who don't have a Social Security number at all, but instead are using something known as the ITIN number, the Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. The Bipartisan Policy Center, a Washington-based think tank, notes that most experts believe the vast majority of returns filed with ITINs today are filed by undocumented immigrants. Some non-citizens who legally immigrate to the United States also pay taxes using this method if they have not had their Social Security numbers issued to them yet. In 2019, according to the IRS, more than 2.5 million tax returns were filed using ITINs, accounting for $6 billion in taxes collected by the U.S. government. That's $6 billion filed by undocumented immigrants working undocumented in the United States following the law. In addition to tax return filings, officials estimate that undocumented immigrants also contribute billions and billions and billions of dollars to Social Security annually through payroll tax deductions. For example, in 2010, the Social Security Administration estimated that payments from unauthorized workers accounted for about $12 billion in Social Security tax revenue. Immigrant rights advocates post on social media during tax season have drawn attention to the issue. The National Immigration Law Center wrote in a series of recent posts, undocumented immigrants pay billions in taxes to fund programs they can't even access. Jose Antonio Vargas, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist turned activist who turned his struggles as an undocumented immigrant into a platform for advocacy, wrote in 2019 on Twitter, "Yes, undocumented immigrants are helping fund the very system that detains and eventually deports us." In fact, a new study from the Cato Institute found that over the next 30 years, immigrants will pay more in taxes than they will even consume in benefits. This net positive flow in tax contributions shows that immigrants will continue to play an outsized role in supporting public services like schools, safety net programs such as nutrition assistance programs, and even Social Security. Like we just said, undocumented immigrants funded $12 billion in Social Security payments just in the year 2010. Analysis of the 2021 American Community Survey shows that immigrant-led households paid $524 billion in taxes in 2021. This includes $346 billion in federal income taxes and $178 billion in state and local taxes. And these tax contributions from legal immigrants made up 15.9% of total tax revenue the government receives from U.S. residents in 2021. Yet immigrants only make up 13% of U.S. households. So immigrants are paying almost 16% of the total gross tax revenue to the United States that they receive from individual people, yet only make up 13% of the population. Thus, immigrants is a plus for the United States, not a negative. Importantly, Cato's paper also notes that the second-generation immigrants tend to have even a higher level of education than their parents. The results of the Cato model indicate that the taxes paid and earnings received, as well as benefits consumed by individual immigrants, is highly dependent on their age of arrival and education. Now, according to their estimates, an individual with less than a high school education who comes to the United States at age 25 will still have a positive fiscal impact of $216,000 when not including their descendants. Immigrants are also more likely to be working age than U.S.-born residents, increasing levels of education among recent arrivals. It is clear that immigrants are net contributors to these programs and the tax base at large, helping keep safety net programs accessible to those who need them. The bottom line, according to all of these different studies, and I want to point it out during tax season or right after tax season, that immigrants and immigration are a net positive to the United States. Immigrants pay a larger majority of their taxes as a tax base than the average American. Amid continued stalemate in Congress over immigration, President Biden has allowed hundreds of thousands of new immigrants into the United States by significantly expanding the use of humanitarian parole programs for people escaping war and political turmoil around the world. The measures introduced over the past year to offer refuge to people fleeing Ukraine, Haiti, and Latin America offer immigrants the opportunity to fly to the United States, quickly secure work authorization, provided they have a private sponsor to take responsibility for them. As of mid-April, 300,000 Ukrainians legally arrived in the United States under various programs, a number greater than all the people from around the world admitted through the official U.S. refugee program in the last 5 years. By the end of 2023, 360,000 Venezuelans, Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Haitians are expected to gain admission through the same similar private sponsorship initiative introduced in January to stem the unauthorized crossings at the southern border. More people than who were issued immigrant visas from these countries in the last 15 years combined. In the last 15 years, the United States has not accepted 360,000 people from Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Haiti. This year they will. According to a new report from the Pew Research Center, the Biden administration has also greatly expanded the number of people who are in the United States with temporary protected status, a program Donald Trump sought to terminate. About 670,000 people from 16 countries have had their protections extended or have become newly eligible since Biden took office. That's 670,000 people under TPS, 360,000 Venezuelans, Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Haitians, making that 1 million. Another 300,000 Ukrainians. President Biden, by the stroke of his pen, without any act of Congress, was able to make legal 1.3 million people, or will, in the year 2023. Altogether, these temporary humanitarian programs will become the largest expansion of legal immigration in the last 40 years. In adopting the programs for Latin Americans, the Biden administration was responding to widespread criticism over the chaotic situation on the southern border, which saw 1.5 million unauthorized crossings last year. It bypassed years of failed attempts in Congress to legalize undocumented workers already in the country or to make more visas available to employers who wish to bring in temporary workers. The new parole programs are temporary. They expire after 2 years unless they are going to be renewed, but they have already changed arrivals, people coming to the United States. The migrants who were admitted to the country after flooding the border last year have not been allowed to work, not at least for at least 6 months, until after filing their asylum cases. As a result, many have wound up in shelters in cities like New York, which have struggled to accommodate them. These new humanitarian parole programs, in contrast, requires immigrants to first have a sponsor in the United States. This sponsor will take financial responsibility for each of the people that they bring to the U.S. And in return, the United States expeditiously will offer a work permit upon their entry. Employers with worker shortages are welcoming these new arrivals as an important new labor pool. The administration's goal was to discourage the hundreds of thousands of migrants who are arriving at the border by allowing people to apply in a more orderly fashion from their home countries. And after the programs began, overall Border Patrol apprehensions at the border reached their lowest level in 2 years, led by an enormous decline in Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans trying to cross the border. Average weekly apprehensions declined to 46 people in late February, from a high of 1,200 or more just in the first few weeks of January. 20 Republican-led states, including Texas, Florida, Tennessee, and Arkansas, have sued in federal court to suspend the parole program for Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, arguing that it will admit 360,000 new immigrants a year from countries and burden states with additional costs for healthcare, education, and law enforcement. But we just finished saying that immigrants are a net plus. Year after year, it has been demonstrated simply by counting the tax revenue received by the United States government that undocumented immigrants are a net plus. Documented immigrants are a net plus to the U.S. government and actually help supplement the costs for the health care of Americans and help supplement the costs for the health care of for education of Americans and help supplement the costs for law enforcement to better protect and serve us, if you believe that's what they do. And the programs have attracted broad support in the business community in many conservative states like North Dakota, where the oil industry has been struggling to rig operators in the region's notoriously punishing weather. The State Petroleum Council is recruiting people to act as sponsors for new Ukrainian immigrants who can be put to work immediately. And in Utah, where Derek Miller, president of the Salt Lake Chamber, says the state has 100,000 jobs going unfulfilled. You want to get a job and you have a work permit? Go to Utah. They have 100,000 jobs they can't fill. A report last week from FWD.US, a bipartisan pro-immigration group, estimated that about 450,000 immigrants who entered the United States on parole programs from Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Latin American countries were filling jobs in industries facing critical labor shortages, including construction, food service, healthcare, and manufacturing. Humanitarian parole has been used in the past. The authority granted by Congress to the executive branch in 1952 expedites admission of people who do not qualify under established immigration categories. President Eisenhower, he was a Republican. He used parole authority to allow 15,000 refugees to enter the United States after the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Parole was used to admit 690,000 Cubans by President Carter and 360,000 refugees from Southeast Asia after the fall of Saigon. Over the last several administrations, some of the most consequential immigration policies have resulted from presidents exercising their discretion for immigration, including former President Barack Obama's executive action to create the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Program, DACA, which gave young undocumented immigrants work permits and a reprieve from deportation. Trump used his authority to ban travel to the United States from a list of very targeted countries. If you remember the shithole countries that he said. Senator Bob Menéndez unveiled an immigration plan on April 18th that relies heavily on executive action to address migration flows in the Western Hemisphere. Executive action works and humanitarian parole works, and Senator Bob Menéndez wants Biden to do more because Congress is not acting. Menéndez's proposal reads that it largely includes policies that President Biden can pursue without Congress until Republicans decide to come to the table and help the administration manage the current immigration challenges. Menéndez, who is the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman, is attempting to reset President Biden's approach to the issue of immigration, pivoting to real-world solutions from the political tug-of-war where the conditions at the border constitute a crisis. Menéndez told CNN this morning, "I don't call it a crisis, but it can become one if you understand that there are 20 million people in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America, in Central America, in the Caribbean, West Indies, who are displaced, who are refugees, who are seeking asylum across the hemisphere. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that unless we work with other countries in our own hemisphere, they're going to march north." The proposal focuses on 4 pillars to effectively manage migration to the Americas: an expansion of legal pathways for immigrants to the United States, an increase in border security resources, expanded aid to countries in the region to amplify their own asylum and refugee programs, and increased efforts to combat organized crime and smuggling. The plan reads, successive U.S. administrations have designed their domestic and foreign policies to respond to shifting needs at the border, an approach that has not created a sustainable long-term solution to a mixed flow of migrants and refugees. That approach, according to the plan, has created an immigration system that's enforcement-driven, reactive, and overly focused on punitive policies, overly focused on deterring migrants once they arrive at the borders, overly focused on arresting people. This plan's new proposals rely heavily on executive action. These are things that President Biden can do with a stroke of the pen. He does not need Congress. And this is a recognition that immigration reform has been out of reach for decades and that Congress is ineffective. Congress will not change the law. And Senator Menéndez is urging President Biden, who has already made programs for Haiti, programs for Ukraine, programs for Nicaragua, programs for Cuba, to make more programs for more countries. It was warmly received by immigrant advocates. Kerry Talbot, Deputy Director of the Immigration Hub, an immigration policy advocacy group, applauded the plan's focus on so-called, quote, push factors like political repression in places like Cuba, Venezuela, or Nicaragua, and its focus on enabling legal pathways rather than deterrence to address economic and social pull factors. Pull factors are something that pulls you out of your country and into the United States of America. The plan calls for an increase in U.S. funding for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees on the premise that the Western Hemisphere hosts 20% of the world's at-risk population, but only receives 8% of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees budget. This proposal from a top Democratic player, Senator Menéndez, is the head of a Senate committee, and he is a top Democratic player in the immigration space, comes ahead of the May 11th deadline for the end of Title 42, a border management policy tied to the pandemic emergency. Administration officials have scrambled to find a replacement for Title 42, which allows officials to ignore asylum claims and quickly expel migrants at the border. The Menéndez proposal also comes a day after Republicans unveiled their first comprehensive border plan. A 130-page bill due for consideration in the House Judiciary Committee on Wednesday. Menéndez plans takes aim at some of these Republican immigration policies, including the practice by some Republican-led states to relocate migrants to Democratic-controlled cities, often without coordinating logistics. Under Menéndez's plan, migrants would be relocated to their final destinations within the United States by federal authorities working in conjunction with the state and local governments. The plan reads, federal relocation by the Department of Homeland Security is needed to end the current challenge of states independently sending migrants to major urban centers without intergovernmental coordination. In a controversial border policy that has been tied up in legal battle in the nation's high court, lawmakers and authorities are laying the framework on how to handle the expected surge of migrants in 3 weeks. Title 42, the Trump-era policy that allows border officials to turn away migrants at the southern border, has been used 2.9 million times since it was implemented in 2020 and is set to end on May 11th. The policy states that it may be lifted when the public health emergency is officially over. Well, the public emergency is over. The CDC director determined that the danger of further introduction of COVID-19 in the United States has declined. Now, the Biden administration temporarily lifted Title 42 through a CDC order, which led to a lawsuit from Republican states. However, via public health emergency declaration expiration, it will end automatically on May 11th. News Nation reported that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security is bracing for a potential surge of thousands or maybe tens of thousands of migrants at the southern border. As of last week, there are more than 25,000 people in ICE custody, 1,000 fewer than the week before, and ICE does not have the capacity to hold many more. Victor Avila, a retired ICE special agent, said agents are already implementing changes in the El Paso, Texas sector. Avila says he's spoken to agents in El Paso, and they're not having interviews. They have no ability to vet anybody because there's more than 1,000 people behind that person running into the country. Plus, the administration has told them, no, move them along, move them quickly. And by the way, that's what I'm seeing in my practice. Immigration is catching, holding, and releasing. They are not vetting anybody at this moment for asylum. Many clients I've spoken to, I said, did anybody even ask you about asylum? Did you get a credible fear interview? And I was told no, time and time and time again. They were held for 1, 2, 3 days and released and told it would be followed up with an immigration court hearing. At which point, all of these people would need to file for asylum and be granted asylum, or they would get deported. But the asylum check at the border, the credible fear interview, that's not happening. Multiple sources at the border confirm that sectors are preparing for a surge by putting up additional processing facilities. In the Yuma, Arizona area, tents are being put up, spaces being cleared for staging areas. In the first 5 months of the fiscal year, U.S. Customs and Border Protection encountered more than 1.5 million people nationwide trying to cross the border without inspection. CBP has returned less than 500,000 people under Title 42, with 444,000 migrants removed without process. Last year, it expelled 1.1 million migrants without due process who entered illegally. The rest have been released and are awaiting court hearings. CBP confirmed it's no longer designating migrants as special interest, and that being from a special interest country is no longer grounds for deportation. And this week kicks off the We Love Immigrant New York City campaign. The Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs kicked off Immigrant Heritage Week by launching the We Love Immigrant New York City campaign. Manuel Castro, the commissioner of the New York City Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, said our campaign, We Love Immigrant New York, looks to affirm and celebrate the contributions of all our immigrant communities. Immigrant Heritage Week is a week-long celebration commemorating the 116th anniversary of April 17th, 1907. That is the day in New York City on which the largest number of immigrants, 11,000, were legally allowed to enter the United States through Ellis Island, which is now closed. But years ago, 100 years ago, people would come by boat and they would process in Ellis Island and then be allowed to immigrate to the United States. It shines a spotlight on the contributions, history, and culture of the city's diverse immigrant communities through events and programs, including the release of 25 illustrations every week. New York City Public Library branches will host discussions about different ethnic communities. Mayor Eric Adams said Immigrant Heritage Week is a celebration of the countless contributions that immigrants have made, just like those who came to this country through Ellis Island looking for a better life and contributed to our city's cultural richness and economic prosperity. My great-grandparents all came through Ellis Island. Fun fact. Here's a nice story. 4 years ago, Trump's immigration policy tore this family apart, and now they're finally reunited. Neri Ortega Lima, a 47-year-old Guatemalan man living in Rhode Island, and his wife Lillian Yanis, 44, and their 3 youngest children were reunited just a few months ago for the first time in 4 years after being separated by Donald Trump's zero-tolerance policy at the U.S.-Mexico border. In 2018, Ortega Lima and his teenage son, Neri Jr., left Lillian and the 2 other children and trekked from Guatemala to escape the gang violence in their village. Neri Jr. was 14, but at only 13, a gang started threatening to kill him unless he joined the group. This left the family terrified. After a harrowing journey across Mexico, including being crammed by smugglers into a suffocating tractor-trailer with other frightened migrants for a long journey with no food, water, or even a toilet, Neri Jr. and his father crossed into El Paso, Texas, and were quickly apprehended by Border Patrol. Ortega Lima told The Guardian he and Neri Jr. were detained with more than a dozen families. He recalled a very mean lady coming into the room and yelling, "You're all being deported!" Explaining Trump's zero-tolerance policy that criminalized unauthorized border crossings, jailed adults, separated them from their children or babies. The father only had a few moments to say goodbye to his son. Ortega Lima was then jailed, left his child within minutes, chained by hand, chained at the foot, and unable to find out for 10 days what happened to his son, Neri Jr. Neri Jr., unbeknownst to his father, was taken to a shelter in New York City, 2,000 miles away from the Texas border. In a very crowded, freezing cell, the father was deported. Neri was in the icebox, and he was deported, leaving Neri Jr. in the shelter 2,000 miles away in New York City. 4 months, this child stayed in the shelter in New York City. And finally, his older sister, an adult who was then married to a U.S. citizen, who lived in Rhode Island, 4 months later found out where her brother was after searching for 4 months and got him out of the shelter and took her 13-year-old brother with her to Rhode Island. In September 2018, Ortega Lima, he's the father, was offered a chance to make an asylum request at the border with the nonprofit Otro Lado, which translates to the other side, or Al Otro Lado. After a long process, he was approved for entry into the United States with the other parents who had been separated from their children under the Trump administration. Neri Jr. and his father, Ortega Lima, remembered April 14, 2019 as one of the best days of their lives when they were finally reunited. The teenager came home after classes at one of Rhode Island's public school newcomer programs, not knowing his father was waiting there to surprise him. In 2021, the new administration of Joe Biden established a family reunification task force after more than 3,900 children were separated from their families between January 2017 and January 2021. The task force partnered with nonprofits like Al Otro Lado to reach out to families in Central America and help them reunite in the United States. Advocates implored the authorities to allow husband and wife, their other teenage son, Douglas, 13, and Layla, 9, to be reunited in America. Douglas made it in first, and finally, in January of this year, Yanis and Layla boarded a plane to Boston. Yanis is exploring English classes and waiting for her work permit. Neri Jr. had dropped out of class to work at a car wash to pay the bills, while Ortega Lima initially suffered from vertigo. Doctors suggested his vertigo was caused by stress of the separation. He improved with treatment and is working in construction now, while Neary Jr. is still at the car wash every day. 9-year-old Layla is already dreaming about being a nurse. Neary Jr. wants to save up to buy himself a Dodge Charger someday. Their asylum cases are pending. Yana says she's just grateful she can cook her Guatemalan pescado seco fish for the family again. She noted earnestly that the U.S. is a hard country to get into. Ending a 30-year saga. This is another nice story. A judge ruled Haitian activists targeted by ICE should not face deportation ever again. Immigrant activist John Montreville is the co-founder of the New Sanctuary Coalition, a nonprofit organization that works with immigrants facing detention and deportation. John himself was deported to Haiti in January 2018 for a 30-year-old aggravated felony charge. He and his supporters say he'd been targeted for his activism by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. John is the father of 4 U.S. citizen children, one of whom, his son Josiah, is also a cancer survivor. We had Gene's family on Bradshaw Live as he was being held in ICE detention right before his deportation. Then in October 2021, Gene was given a second chance when Virginia Governor Ralph Northam granted him a pardon for the 2 drug convictions that ICE had used as a pretext to deport him. This gave Gene the opportunity to seek to reopen his case and regain his legal immigration status. He was allowed to return to the United States on a 90-day special parole. We spoke with Gene and his family again at his church, Judson Memorial Church in Washington Square, New York City, where a celebration of his return took place. But Gene had to continue to fight to remain with his family in New York, and the threat of deportation continued to hang over his head. Until Tuesday, April 18th, when an immigration judge ruled that Gene will no longer face deportation. In a courtroom packed with supporters, the judge told Gene, "I want you to know I see the good in you, too." In an interview with Democracy Now! After the decision, Gene said he will probably apply for citizenship now, saying, "I've been here for almost 40 years. This is the only country that I know." Gene was convicted in 1989 in the state of Virginia on drug charges. He was arrested with his friend. They didn't catch him in the act of doing anything. He was just in a hotel with him. He had gone to the store to get a bite to eat, and when he came back, the police were there. They asked if he was staying with his friend. He said yes, so they arrested both of them. It was his first offense. He was 18 years old at the time, and he was given 33 years in jail. Gene served 11 of those years, and while still incarcerated, the Bush administration changed immigration laws to include aggravated felony as a means of deportation. They charged Gene with an aggravated felony retroactively, even though when he was arrested at age 18, the term aggravated felony had no meaning because it wasn't even in the law. But after Gene served his time, went through parole, married, had children, started a business, decades later, 30 years later, he was deported. Now, Gene's story finally has a happy ending, and we're thrilled for him and his family. And his story shows how being arrested or convicted of a crime can affect your immigration status in the United States, and why it's very important for anyone who has been arrested or charged with a crime to consult a very good immigration attorney, as well as a good criminal defense attorney, to find out exactly how these cases could affect your immigration status. When we spoke with Gene in 2021, this is before he knew that his case would be over, and he was fighting it out. He told us what his American dream is, and here's what he had to say.
My dream has always been the same. Watch my kids grow up, be there for them, to support them in any way that I can, and then watch them. I mean, my life basically has been over already. It's all about the kids. Once you start having kids, it's all about them. And I love my kids dearly. They love me to death, and I'm here for them. And watch my daughter, graduate from high school, and hopefully to college, see her raise her own family. That would be my dream.
All right. It's nice. It's a nice story that eventually he's all resolved. And by the way, he's going to be able to be filed for his citizenship now. Because you want to know why? Because although he's an aggravated felon, and generally aggravated felons are deportable and can't become a citizen, his aggravated felony was prior to November 17th, 1990. And if you have an aggravated felony prior to November 17th, 1990, you're still eligible to become a citizen, provided you otherwise have good moral character. Thanks for watching. For more Bradshaw Live, like and subscribe to our YouTube channel.